Well, here we are getting ready to wrap up chapter 6. We're going to talk specifically about slowing the human population growth. Now, there is some controversy on whether population growth needs to slow. Just to put that out there. Not everybody thinks we need to slow the population down. Not everybody thinks there is. Some people think it'll take care of itself. But most scientists, most politicians looking around realize if we don't slow the population growth, we run into more problems than we get benefits. But remember, you get a rapidly declining population, you don't have enough labor force, so not everybody sees the same way. But this is going to be true in almost everything throughout your life, etc. We try and make what the best decisions are and move forward. So we're going to look at what it takes or would take in order to slow the population growth. Now, typically in the developing or the less developed countries is where we tend to see more poverty, and we also tend to see those kind of temporally spike with a lot of population, and they're going to be targeted for very rapid growth. We tend to see these in more poverty-stricken nations. So if we can reduce poverty through economic development, we feel that that winds up benefiting everybody. Higher economic development, they're better off, more well educated, but it also tends to slow population. This was my job in Nepal. I've talked about I worked in Nepal for about 10 years, and this is what I did. It was economic development, specifically to try and target communities that were very poverty, did not have much, and help them with some economic development to get their entire village and society a better way of life for the long-term goal that their population would be more stable. Everybody would have better jobs, health, etc. But this is what I did. So when I refer to it back and forth, we were doing economic development. By doing the economic development, we were really also working very hard to raise the status of women. We would do women's literacy programs within it, do a lot of teaching and training, and then there's just some encouragement of family planning and some of the education, just teaching how babies are born, what is the process and what you can do to potentially slow it, and the benefits one way or another. The chart we're putting up here is when we look at this economic development, there's 4 stages, and they're very easy to remember actually, because they just all have to do around being an industrial population. So you're either pre-industrial, transition, you're transitioning into industrial, and then moving into post-industrial. Post-industrial is going to be places that are truly developed countries. Japan, America, England, etc. We're beyond just manufacturing. We now have a lot more technology, truly into the information age. These societies are largely agricultural. They're not doing a lot of manufacturing, it's subsistence farming. A lot of what we did, or my family we worked with in Nepal, or my company, Global Partners, that we worked with there, we would go into villages where the women were going out and having to collect the water, collect the firewood, bring that back. There was very little education. Some of the men would wind up getting some education, the women almost none. The women were taking care of all of the basic needs just for survival, as far as cooking the food, all the domestic work, gathering firewood, gathering water, etc. And they were just barely subsiding. We would come in, we would try and bring water to the village. By bringing water to the village, we could then show them how to use the water. That way the women weren't having to spend 2 and 3 hours a day gathering water and gathering firewood. We could bring the water to the people. We could take the excess runoff, and they could start doing kitchen gardening, so they had more food. They could raise more animals. As they began to raise food, we would then do women's literacy and women's education, because once again, we freed up 2 to 3 hours of the women's time, so we would get the village elders to buy into, okay, it's fair that they get some classes and they can learn to read and write, where we would teach the women because in turn the women would then teach the children. You teach a man and a man learns something. You teach a woman and the whole family learns it. So we would go in and teach the women's literacy, also educational practices out of that time that we saved up for everybody. We would teach them how to kitchen garden. Once they were doing kitchen gardening and now they were raising more food than they could just eat, we would then help them set up markets so that they could sell their excess food on the markets on the road to other people coming in and out. And from that point, we could raise the status of the village to the point that they could apply to the government to get a government school, and then the government would put in a school because they had to meet certain criteria. And in a period of about 5 years, we could take a village from no water and they had to walk out for everything and very little education to having water at their village, kitchen gardens in their backyard, developing a market for the village, and then the government coming in and bringing in a government-paid school and school teacher, which would largely elevate the status of the village. And this is that transitional stage. And where we were in Nepal was this transitional stage. And all the squiggly lines we see, the red one is the birth rate. And the birth rate tends to go up and down. The death rate stays high as well, and the total population stays low. Infant mortality is high. Everybody's out there working in the fields. It's very hard work. People don't usually live beyond 50 or so. So the death rate is high, the infant mortality rate is high, and the population stays low. In Nepal, we were in this transitional phase at the time that we left. The birth rate is staying about the same, but the death rate is dropping, and the total population is climbing. But what we see happens eventually as they move into the industrial age, the population will start to level, and of course the death rate drops, the birth rate tends to drop, and eventually we get into this post-industrial, more stable population. This is what we're striving for on a worldwide scale. If we can get more people having better economic development and making it through that demographic transition better, poverty declines. Now, some of the threats to this transition, trying to take a group of people or a village or a country from agricultural to industrial, even though it's something that most people say, yes, this is what we want, can be difficult. Extreme poverty is really hard to work against that. That's what we were up against in Nepal. It was extreme poverty, so it was a slow process, but we could see it taking place. They were still largely agricultural. Their markets were largely from what they were growing and selling, but as they were growing and selling, more people would branch off, and somebody say, oh, well, I don't have to be the farmer in the family, I'm going to become a carpenter. So we would still have 3 to 4 children, but only 2 of them kind of stayed at the farm, and a couple of them would branch out into something else. And we were seeing the women beginning to have fewer children as we left, so you only have 2 to 3, but one would still continue to raise the garden, etc., but somebody would branch into something else. We'd get into more industrial. But poverty is something difficult to deal with. War is. War comes along, ravages, people go back into subsistence. You're not going to create businesses, you're not going to in a state of war. You're just surviving. And of course, along with it, the environmental degradation and resource depletion. With a lot of high population, they tend to have some environmental degradation. But these are things that can slow that process of moving from pre-industrial to industrial and on into post-industrial, as most of the developed world is. One of the big keys here really does come into educating and empowering women. What we have found in every culture, when women get higher education, they have fewer children. When they're able to earn an income themselves, they have fewer children. And when society does not suppress their rights. Boy, when we lived in Nepal, women's rights were horrible. We would go to a restaurant. If I happened to go to the bathroom and the waiter came to the table, he wouldn't even take an order from my wife until I got back. Because as the male, I would say what everybody wanted to eat. Just the way that women were basically viewed, very different than how it was here. Now, once again, that's just the way the culture was. But when society doesn't suppress the rights of women, they, as a general rule, give birth to fewer children, which keeps the population more in check. Now, typically throughout most of the world, especially in these less developed countries, women typically do most of the domestic work and child care. They're taking care of the house, they're cleaning the floors, they are doing the whole thing. They're going to get wood. Once again, we witnessed this. The women having to go in the forest to cut down the wood to bring it back. I'll put a few pictures up of the loads that they would carry as they were bringing stuff back to the house. Think about a 5-gallon bucket of water. You ever carried one? Well, I would watch 9-year-old girls carry 5-gallon buckets of water for over an hour. They would walk an hour to get to it, fill it, and carry an hour back. Carry a 5-gallon bucket an hour a day. See how you like it. It's pretty rough stuff. But they also tend to have unpaid health care, and they have fewer rights and less educational opportunities as the men. This is just a general rule in a lot of the less developed countries. So, educating and empowering women is a key step to getting into a slower population growth. Along with that, a lot of times comes family planning, teaching and educating the whole family on planning for what you're going to have. How many children are you going to have? How are you going about having the children? At what age do you want the children separated out? I remember when my wife and I were first married and talking about it and how many children we wanted and kind of how close together did we want them based on some of, like my brothers and sisters and my wife's. I remember talking about all of that stuff and trying to come up with a plan. Plans don't always work out exactly like you want, but it's important to be able to go through that process. So, if you have family planning, and now I'm talking about this as something that exists in a culture that people can go to. There's people out there going, hey, we're going to do family planning seminars today. We did this as part of our work in women's literacy. We teach the women to read, and then a lot of family planning went on in some of the meetings. So it helps reduce unintended pregnancies. Once again, we planned to have 3 children, but we had 6. How did that happen? It also helps reduce unintended abortions, because they say we only wanted this and now we have this and I don't think I can plan for it. I don't think I can afford it. And the women trying to have abortions, and a lot of them are not safe. They're not going to a hospital or a clinic to get this done. A lot of these abortions can be very unsafe, and it leads to deaths and harmful effects on the women and then the whole communities. There tends to be a lot better maternal and child health care. You have better maternal and child health care, you tend to have less infant mortality. And then there's just a lot of financial benefits. And you have 6 kids, and nobody hardly has enough to survive. You have 3 kids, and everybody has a little bit more. So there's just a lot of financial benefits, typically. Problems with it. Well, a lot of times there's just a lack of access to voluntary contraception. We really would like to reduce, but we can't afford whatever the contraception is, or somebody in the village doesn't allow it. We do not want that. It should just happen the way nature has it planned. So sometimes there's a lack of access. Once again, I want to, but maybe it's not there, maybe somebody's not allowing it. They're not using safe or effective methods. Well, we will not have sex when the crows are cawing. Okay, sure, that sounds like a great idea, but it has nothing to do with the science of when a woman can actually give birth. She has to be ovulating for it to happen, and there are ways to know if that's going on. So if you're not using safe or you're not using effective planning methods, no amount of planning does any good. And then sometimes just child marriage customs. In a lot of less developed countries, girls are still getting married at the age of 14 because you have 6 children and 3 of them are girls. If I can get a couple of them married off, I'm not having to take care of them. It eases it up for our family. And child marriages are still very much a thing. Even if it's illegal in the country, the village may turn a blind eye to what the legality says. And this is unfortunately still a very common practice in a lot of the world. So family planning is an important factor, and it's something that we try and get instilled and take and put in place, but it gets resistance. Now, let's look at India. India is the second most populous country in the world, and in your lifetime, it will probably become the most populous because there's a lot of reasons for it. Some of them are just these demographics of what the countries between China, who is number 1, and India, who is number 2, look like. It is not going to take long for India to take over China, barring some odd situation. Currently, they have a population of about 1.4, 1.5 billion. But unfortunately, within India, there is a lot of poverty, a lot of malnutrition, and a lot of environmental degradation. Once again, India is about 1/3 the size of the U.S., something like that. It's considerably smaller than the United States. We have some 330 million people, and they have 1.4 billion people. They have 1 billion people more than we do in a much smaller area. So there's a lot of environmental degradation, over farming, etc. So within India, many poor couples. Now, all of India isn't poor. They have a bigger middle class than our entire population, and they have some very wealthy individuals, but there's a lot of poverty there as well, and it's all mixed in. Most poor couples want a lot of children. That way, multiple children can go work. This person can go carry tea. This person can work in the field. This kid can do this. And they put their kids to work at a super early age, like 4 and 5 and 6, if they possibly can. And then they also figure, well, when I get an old age, if I have more children, they'll be able to care for me, because it'll take all of them pitching in to provide for me or help care for me, or maybe one of them will make it okay and I can live with them in my old age. So poorer couples tend to want to have more children so they can hedge their bets. The odds of something good happening gets more. That's the thought. Doesn't always work that way. Also, there tends to be a bias in a lot of these less developed countries or in poverty areas towards having male children. They tend to see boy children as being better, that they can do more, or they'll have better opportunities, and they can do this or that. So, and about only 48% of the couples use modern birth control. But going back to the male, so we want to have 2 children, and your first 2 children are girls. I really want to have 2 children, but I kind of wanted to have 2 boys. So you have another child, you have a third girl, and then you have a boy. Oh, but we only have 1 boy now. Should we try it? This happens. I have seen it over and over. When you favor one type of offspring, a male or female, over the other, it tends to lead to, in a sense, unwanted births. What we really wanted was 2 boys and 2 girls. What we got was 5 girls and 2 boys. Just a difficulty. And once again, only about 48% of couples are even using modern birth control methods. So there's a lot of, unwanted pregnancies, if you will. Now, the chart we're looking up here is just a straight. Blue is male, red is female. So on one side block, this is India in 2010. So 10-year-old data, but we kind of see this typical growth. Once again, the very top end of that are people being 100 years old, very few. And we see the growth. But if you look at India in 2035, You see how that is right now? The biggest part is down at the bottom. So we have a lot of girls in the pre-reproductive stage. As those girls move into the reproductive stage, the population is going to swell. So India is set right now for a pretty big population boom, which is why more than likely India is going to surpass China in short term. Probably in less than 10 years, their numbers will be greater than China, because China is kind of peaking and China's population may actually begin to level off and go down. So, how did China do that? China did slow their population growth tremendously. They have been the fastest moving through that transitional phase of anyone else, that their TFR, total fertility rate, was 3.0 in the 60s, and by 1978, in 18 years, they took it down to 1.8. No country has ever seen a transition that fast, so how did China do it? Well, in the 60s, they looked around in their population, they said, we're in trouble, because they had that very classic, most of our people are pre-reproductive. As soon as they move into reproductive, there's going to be an explosion. And they were, for the most part, more poverty. So all these people are going to have more and more children for all the reasons we talked about. Hands to work the farm, maybe better off for me when I retire, not knowing how, having a preference for males, whatever. So the government put in very strict family planning and birth control. They put the one-child policy into effect. If you only have one child, that child has preference for education, preference to get a job, you get money for it, etc. If you have two children, then you lose all of it. Even the first child lost all the preferential because your family had two. And then they provided free family planning for everybody, including having an abortion. If you wound up getting an unwanted pregnancy, you could go and get a state-sponsored abortion, if you will. This one-child policy was instilled throughout China, and it reduced the number of children born tremendously. However, this doesn't come without negative effects. You know, the world kind of looked a little bit in shock. I'm like, what? Only one child and you're enforcing it, and there are all these benefits if you only have one child, and there are all these penalties if you have more than one child, and state-sponsored abortion, etc. Well, China definitely had a preference for a male child. People, if we're going to have one child, I want to have a male child. So if you had a female, when you got an ultrasound, many people had abortions so that they could have their one child. So this led to way too few females. Currently, right now, there's like 30 million more Chinese men than women. So there's nobody to date. It's like you're the guy in class and there's 20 of you in the classroom and there's 3 girls. What are the odds of me getting a date? Unless I look really something, not as many. So it creates a problem. By 2030, we feel just in 10 years, we feel there's not going to really be enough young workers to support the elderly population. Once again, you wind up getting this skewed, heavier adult population. So in 2015, the government replaced the one-child policy with the two-child policy. So once again, if you had 2 children, they both had favor to be able to get jobs, to be able to get good schools, education. But if you have 3, then the penalties kick in. So they went from the one child, because now they've pulled their population down. But this is why India is going to overtake China very quickly, because their population is like this instead of like this. So the inevitability is that India is going to overtake China as the most populous country. China knew they had a population problem. They took drastic measures as an entire government and country. A lot of people weren't sure about it, but it is something that did function and work, but it's not always without its issues. Within this chapter, some of our big ideas that we're really looking at is the human population is growing rapidly. Now, that's just a fact. The human population is growing rapidly. We may soon bump up against environmental limits. Not everybody agrees with that, but most cultures, most people, most scientists do. That we're getting right up against these environmental limits of what the planet can handle. So a combination of population growth and increasing the rate of resources per person is expanding our ecological footprint. So as we get more and more people on the planet, and as we try and elevate and raise everybody's status, we tend to use more resources per person, and this raises our entire ecological footprint, which strains our natural capital. Once again, we can't use up all of the natural capital. We need it for air and food and water, all these economics or all these environmental services. We can slow the population growth by reducing poverty, which would be a good thing. We can also elevate the status of women and encourage family planning. Doing the three of those, reducing poverty, elevating the status of women, and encouraging family planning are all positive, and there's no downside. There's no negative to those. So those are all three areas that all of us should work towards, contribute towards, or bare minimum support, because there's only benefit all the way around for those three aspects. Now for this, the end of the chapter, we just want to kind of tie it all together real quick, look at what we've sort of covered in the chapter in a quick snippet. Now, many people, most, believe that exponential growth is unsustainable in the long run. We can't keep the J curve going forever. It's got to start moving into a S curve. The more that we can employ solar and other renewable technologies is going to help reduce pollution, emissions, and these climate changing gases. So we want to do more of the renewable power options as much as we can. We need to reuse and recycle materials so that, once again, it uses less energy and we don't have as much waste. And we need to focus on preserving the biodiversity. The more biodiverse our ecosystems are, the healthier they are, and the better they provide those ecological services like oxygen, water, food that we all have to have. So this just kind of wraps up chapter 6, looking at things about population. Take care, and we'll see you next time.